Hello everyone, what a player Sindarov is. So we're going to look at his game today against Nakamura, and we'll follow the game from the black side. Sindarov had black, and it's more interesting to experience this game from his perspective. So Nakamura has white and starts with the pawn to d4. So Sindarov plays d5. Nakamura plays c4, the queen gambit. And Sindarov doesn't let his pawn get pushed out of the center. No, he keeps it on d5 and protects it with the pawn on a6. Knight c3 is played by Nakamura. Knight c3 isn't just to increase the pressure on the pawn on d5, It's to prepare the central push with a4. And that's why black often play knight to f6 to defend the pawn, but also to lock down the e4 square so that white can't advance in the center, at least not right away. But Sindarov instead plays the pawn to c6. So it's true that his pawn structure is very solid, but he allows this push to e4. And Nakamura doesn't hesitate, he plays e4 immediately. So capture on e4, knight recaptures, and white have a better center of pawn, an advantage in space. But Sindarov follows up with bishop to b4, check. And how do you block this check? Carlsen had already faced this position in his World Championship match against Anand several years ago, and Carlsen responded by retreating the knight to c3, bringing the knight back. But Nakamura is going to play a variation that I myself use when I have white in this position. It's the variation with bishop to d2. So let's try to understand this variation, because when white play bishop to d2, they block the queen's defense of the pawn on d4. And so the black queen can capture the pawn on d4, attacking the knight with check. And it's a variation where white will lose several pawns, but it will give them very strong play on the color with huge threats on the black square. Let me show you. By the way, that's exactly what happened in the game. Sindarov takes the pawn on d4. Nakamura takes the bishop. Sindarov gets revenge on the knight with check. Bishop e2. And in this position, black have won a pawn. They can even win a second one, but they have to deal with the bishop on b4, which is very troublesome on its diagonal, as it will hinder the safety of the king, and the queen can sometimes join forces with the bishop in mating attacks. So how should you play with black? Sindarov is very precise. You absolutely have to play knight a6 now and not rush to take the pawn on g2. Why? Because when you play knight to a6, you attack the bishop and put it in a difficult position. If the bishop comes to a3, you can play c5, and in the end, the bishop won't be able to do anything. So you might say, the bishop can go to another square, it can go to d6. But on d6, the bishop will end up blocking that square. That square, which could have been used by the queen if the bishop was behind, but also a square that could be used by the knight on g1. Let me show you. For example, if black are not as precise as Sindarov and don't play knight a6, but instead go after the pawn on g2, then white play bishop f3, of course, attacking the queen while protecting the rook. The queen often retreats to g5, and now knight e2, with the possibility of playing rook g1, that's right, and having a lot of development despite being down 2 pawns. But the knight can also aim for the square g3. In fact, that's often what's preferred, to come to e4, attack the queen, and look for entry points on d6. This black square is very hard for black to defend. We can see that they no longer have a bishop of the black square. The knights are very awkward when it comes to defending this square. This square, supported by the queen, by the bishop, the arrival of the knight, or sometimes the arrival of the queen, would be disastrous for black. That's why knight a6 is much more precise. We don't take the pawn on g2 right away, and we force the bishop to occupy square d6 to block it. The queen and the knight will no longer be able to use this d6 square in the attack against the black king. And now the black queen comes to take the pawn on g2. This changes a lot of things in this opening. Bishop f3 attacks the queen, which retreats to g5, knight e2, knight e7, knight g3, and you can see that the knight is ready to come to e4. But we understand that the bishop on d6 blocks this square, so the idea of knight d6 will not be possible. Black castle kingside, and here the best move according to the computer is still to play knight to e4. Try to destabilize the queen from protecting the knight, so the queen would give check on a5, as happened in the game, because in the game Nakamura played the pawn to h4. But the computer prefers the move knight e4 to bring the knight into play a bit. But h4 was played, so queen to a5 check, the b4 push, knight takes on b4, and now kingside castling. White have given up another pawn. That's the third one they've given. They gave up a central pawn, they gave up a pawn on the king side, and they gave up a pawn on the queen side. But we must not forget that the knight is under attack, undefended, that the other one is also being targeted, and that we could see moves like queen d2 coming to attack it. So black still have to get through this challenge of defending their knight. So rook e8 was played, queen d2, the double attack on the knight, c5 to protect, and rook d1. And it's true that white have lost 3 pawns, but they still have this play on the dark squares with their dark square bishop. And here they have a terrible threat, which is to play bishop takes knight. Because after rook takes, there would be queen d8 check. And even if the queen takes, the rook recaptures with check, the black rook will have to return to d8, will take, and that will be the back rank mate. So the threat is bishop takes knight. And that's why black play knight to f5. They're attacking the pawn on h4 and the bishop on d6. So the knight being on g3, it eliminates this knight on f5, knight takes, pawn takes. Queen to f4. The knight returns to c6 and king to h1. White open the g file for their rook. And even if black have 3 extra pawns, they're going to have to deal with this attack on the g file. And in the end, this pawn on h4 can join in the attack, you know? If g6 is played, we might see pushes from the pawn on h5. And then there are still the 2 bishops, and the queen isn't too far away either. So once again, you have to get through this test of defending against the king's attack. You'll see that it's not so simple. The knight comes to d4, rook to g1. And here, the threat is terrible, the white threat. I know it's black's move, but to find the right move for black, you first have to spot the white threat. White are threatening to play rook takes g7 check, sacrificing this rook for the pawn, and after that it's a mating attack. For example, this king takes queen g5 check, forcing the king to h8, right? The bishop covers the f8 square, queen f6 check, king g8, and mate will follow with the arrival of the rook on g1. So in this position, rook takes g7 is a threat. That's why black will play g6. But by playing g6, they put all their pawns on white square. And this will make controlling the black square bishop important. You might say instead of g6, we could also play retreating the knight to e6 to defend g7. But then there would be queen takes f5, with moves like bishop e5 to keep attacking g7, preventing the knight from moving because there would be captures on g7, and even, why not, queen f6 afterwards, always keeping up this attack on the black square, trying to break through the pawn on g7 to infiltrate along the black diagonal. So in the game, Sindarov preferred to play g6 immediately. The bishop comes to d5 and positions itself against the king. And once again, there are threats. For example, if black try to play knight e2, the fork, the queen can come to h6, and then after knight takes rook, do you see what white could do? By the way, I invite you to pause the video to figure out how white could win this position. So did you find it? White could sacrifice the bishop on f7. That's a lot of sacrifices, isn't it? They're down a lot of pawns, they give up the rook, and now they sacrifice the bishop. But now queen takes on h7, check, king to f6. And here, there are several moves that win for white. You might think of rook takes knight, which will now attack the pawn on g6, but the computer considers that h5 will checkmate much faster. Why? Because by leaving the rook on the d-file, we block the escape routes of the king. You see, for example, if the king tries to escape to e6, we have queen to g6 check, and after king to d7, the king ends up on the same file as the rook, so the bishop moves back check, forcing the king to come to e7. I don't think there are any other squares, since the bishop controls the rook and the queen as well. So the king is forced to come to e7 and queen f6, checkmate. So we understand that bringing the bishop to d5 creates a threat. It threatens the arrival of the queen on h6, captures here on f7. With captures on h7, we could also have the push to h5, along with attacks on g6, the file. There are still many threats. That's why Sindarov simply plays bishop e6. He blocks the bishop on the white square and keeps this fork for a bit later. Nakamura takes on b7, attacking the rook. Knight e2 this time, the fork. Queen d2, counterattack on the black queen, so the queens are exchanged. Knight takes rook, Nakamura gets revenge on the rook on a8, but rook recaptures, king recaptures, and rook to d8. And Nakamura has 2 extra pawns in this position. 2 extra pawns, and even a third because the pawn on c4 is going to fall. White play bishop f4 to unpin and protect the rook, but in exchange rook takes, bishop takes. Bishop takes on c4, bishop to e3. Bishop takes on a2, bishop takes on c5, attacks the pawn, but a5. And it's true that we know in opposite colored bishop endgames, there are often draws, even when you're down a pawn and sometimes even 2 pawns. But here there are still 3 pawns down, including this distant passed pawn, which will force the bishop to control the blocking square a3. And in reality, there are just too many pawns down. Nakamura won't be able to hold. He'll try, though. He plays f4. He wants to control this g5 square to prevent the black pawn's majority from creating a passed pawn on the other side. But f6, king f2, the kings are centralizing. Bishop a3, king e6, bishop escapes. a4, king e3, king f7, attacks the bishop, which comes to b4, h6. So here, Sindarov has pushed back the bishop to play h6 and threatened the g5 push. King f2, g5, king g3, bishop d5, bishop a3, bishop e4, bishop c1. And here, Sindarov takes on h4 and Nakamura resigns. Why? Of course, he will take the pawn on h4, but the bishop will come to f3, controlling the h5 square. This way, the white king cannot approach the pawn on h6, and the black king will simply help the a-pawn cross the barrier on square a3. White will have to sacrifice their bishop, then the black king will come back to the other side to eliminate the pawn on f4 and win with the passed pawns he will have. So what did you think of this game? Nakamura played very aggressively in the opening, giving up several pawns, gaining a development advantage, and a color play with his pair of bishops. But Sindarov's precise defense did not allow Nakamura to carry out his usual attacks in this opening. Let's look at the standings now. So Sindarov still has a 1-point lead, 4.5 points, but Caruana won his game against Matthias Bluebaum. So Caruana, who had lost the day before to Sindarov, is still right on Sindarov's heels. He's not far behind, he has 3.5 points, and the other players are quite far back. I was about to say goodbye, but let's take a look at the standings for the candidates tournament anyway. Here it is, the standings for the candidates tournament, and here it's a completely different ranking we have, since there isn't really a clear leader. First place is shared by 3 players, Joe Muzichuk and Katarina Laniot. Well, there you have it. It's time to say goodbye. See you soon.